Greetings, dear listeners. Before we get started, a reminder to head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and consider becoming a paying subscriber if you're not one yet. You'll get access to, among other things, the full conversation, as well as other subscriber-only benefits. And don't forget to give us a like and review on your favorite podcast app. With all that out of the way, on to the show.
I am wearing, since we're talking about war, hang on,
War's over. We're talking about
true.
peace. We're
The
talking about
12-day
the Nobel Peace Prize.
Since the 12-day war is over, but since I wrote an article against war in general, I just decided to wear the U.S. men's national jersey from 1994 World Cup to signal that I do love America, and also to stand alongside our national team, because Sunday they face off Costa Rica in the first knockout round of the CONCACAF Gold Cup, which is like the mini World Cup just for North America. So
That's
I know there's a big cross-section of our listeners that are also soccer fans, and I just want everyone to know that I do love America.
You love America.
Despite
And your love of
everything.
America
Yeah.
is against enemy countries and their infidel teams, and we must defeat them, right? Like, and by defeating them, like, bring them low, right? Like, what are the good things in life? What does Conan teach us, Santi?
Conan
Crush your
O'Brien?
enemies. No. Conan the Barbarian.
Conan the Barbarian.
You know the famous thing.
Oh.
Yeah.
Conan
crush
O'Brien
your
also
enemies.
teaches us a lot of things.
To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentations of their women. That's the good life
Yeah.
that Conan teaches.
Well, what do you get from that? Like, what's the rush of that kind of
Well,
violence?
no, I mean, what do you get from defeating Costa Rica? You know.
Well, yeah,
like-
that is true. It's a sort of sublimated violence, especially international soccer. Well, also like
Right.
club soccer too, because it's just like a more local tribe.
a more
that you're
local
supporting.
tribalism, right?
No, it's funny. I saw this like
No, and I
satirical
mean, I guess-
video about life in Germany. This American this group from LA that always puts up like these funny videos, and they're like one day in the life of a German, and it was like, I go to a soccer game, I take my German flag, I go home, and I immediately bury my German flag. I never. It will
see
not come out
again.
until the next soccer game.
But that's changing, I think, in Germany too, right? Like, I mean, they're militarizing again, thanks to Donald Trump. It's good. Like, these things
Yeah.
are.
Sam
Things are
Moyne
happening.
posted a picture of a recruitment poster from the German military, and he was like, "This is terrifying."
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
what's terrifying is the return to the mean. I guess the mean is warfare.
Well, again, I mean, and so that's my, I wouldn't say objection to your piece, but it's I'd engage with it. And again, encourage our listeners who haven't read it yet. It will be in the show notes. It was the Tuesday note this week, written just as peace was breaking out. Unfortunately, we did not know that peace would break out so triumphantly. And I mean, we can talk about that as well, like what a crazy time we live in. Because I don't know if you're following now. Looks like, I don't know, like credible stuff that there's like a big expansion of the Abraham Accords. Like, we'll see that like Hamas really is on its last legs. I saw a story in Reuters just this morning, just how battered Hamas is now with Iran, like, brought low, really flagging spirits. And apparently the Israelis really are backing a bunch of other sort of tribal parties inside Gaza to try and push Hamas out. Who knows? I don't know. Like, weird stuff is happening. Weird stuff. But
Peace is breaking out.
But it's I what I really liked about your piece on the one hand is that you set up I think a pretty strong argument of like a certain kind of against a certain kind of, I think, lazy bit of discourse that is in the public right now that, without admitting it, does end up being kind of fascistically pro-war. And I think you're on very strong grounds then. But where I feel like maybe you lose me a little bit is that you, in arguing against it, you end up in too strong of an anti-war position, because just what I was pushing you on right now with sports is that, making war is perhaps one of the greatest, like, human drives and achievements. Like, so much is created through war. States are created through war. Cultures are created through war. And I think to hive off war and peace, as I think you end up doing at the end of the thing, doesn't do justice to the fact that, like, human beings are, tribal, violent creatures, and like we make war. War is not something that exists outside of us. It's very much us, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know.
What do you mean hive off, by the way?
Well, I don't know. I feel like as soon as you start talking about, war, pro-war and anti-war, I feel at that point you're creating a dichotomy there that I would just argue doesn't really exist. I mean, like, we can deplore the negative aspects of war. We can wish there was less of it. We can, I think, even as you say in your piece, strive that it doesn't happen. As you say, basically, that a lot of the quote unquote pro-war people will definitely allow. But then, I think what I'm saying is, I think you rightly point out that a lot of the sort of that kind of language ends up being crocodile tears, and in effect, a lot of the sort of, people who talk that way have like or are certainly like slipping into a more sort of, I don't know, pro-war fascist register lately.
Yeah.
In this kind of like, we need war to defend the West, and I think you dismantled that properly. But in parts of the essay, I also do feel though that you end up sort of falling into the register of the anti-war, which I think is no less
like a peacenik position, a sort of.
Well, it's just like, I think it's wrong for different reasons. Not wrong, I just like not considered enough for the reason that I'm saying is that to be human is to like engage in war on some level, and war is not something that comes outside of us. It is us. Like, it's what happens when human beings get together, like conflict, right?
Yeah. And it seems to have been with us from the very beginning of the human, at least from the beginning of history, for sure, right? There's no civilization that doesn't record some sort of that doesn't have like stories of war that go along with it.
And I mean, doesn't it feel like self-evident that there's nothing more human than war?
I don't know if there's nothing more human than war, but I think that there's nothing more human than doing evil, I would say.
Okay,
I mean,
sure.
Is there nothing more human than adultery or murder? Like, I mean, we're all messed up. I agree with you there.
Right.
And I agree with you that my position is tenuous at the end, because it's basically I'm anti-pro-war, but I'm not anti-war, because I'm not a pacifist, because I do think sometimes you do have to fight a war, right? And you do have to have defensive warfare, and I don't want to like relitigate just war theory. There's a lot of smart people that are doing that. What I wanted to go against is a sort of cultural bias that I sense, or an ideology even, which I think there's two versions of it, and both of them sort of emerged in the last few weeks with this war between Iran and Israel, and sort of the U.S. One is like the more respectable version, and the other one is the crazier version, but they both agree. I think David Brooks, friend of the podcast, nothing against him personally, but he just, did you see the column yesterday? It's like, Benjamin Netanyahu, I hate Benjamin Netanyahu, but he's right about a lot. And basically he sort of regurgitates his liberal interventionist view. Says, back in the day, Hillary and Reagan, he mentions both of them, they did military interventions for behalf of democracy, blah, blah, blah. Iraq, blah, blah, blah. He talks about the shortcomings of the view. And at the end, he says, if the United States retreats and does not engage militarily with these rogue regimes, we leave the world to the wolves, right?
Yeah,
your friend Josep Borrell.
he was the foreign policy guy. He was the foreign affairs, the external, whatever, their diplomatic service of the EU.
Right. And then 2024, I pulled it up here, if we can put it in the show notes, but he says something like, the world is getting more dangerous. Europe is a walled garden, and outside is a jungle that's encroaching, right?
Yeah.
The same vision that we need to strengthen our walls. The only thing that maintains all of the great achievements of Western civilization is this fortress, right? And then that's the respectable version. Those are respectable.
But
then there's Edward Luttwak, who basically says, there's an interview that I pulled up in a sort of right-wing magazine that I think they pulled it down, the whole magazine, so I found it in Wayback Machine. But he talks about how, like, war is really... He blames the decline in births in Europe to the lack of war.
Yeah, I
right?
remember that.
He
like
really believes that war is a creative force. And this is what you're saying. You've heard of Heraclitus, I assume. I just pulled up his quote. War is the father of all and the king of all. It proves some to be gods and others human beings. It makes some slaves and others free. And I don't know what he meant by Heraclitus. I don't know. But I don't believe that. That's my basic thing. I don't believe that war is the creative force. I don't believe.
Okay, but let's just go back to the Borrell quote about walls, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can quibble about whether it's barbarism outside of Europe, but like, I don't think one can or should quibble about the idea of borders, and the enforcement of those. I mean, I guess the danger, I think, in tearing down that thing, like, it doesn't mean that everything needs to be militarized, but like, I do think that the implication of what at least Borrell is saying is that there are borders, and those borders, you can't pretend they don't exist. Mm-hmm. And you can't kumbaya your way out of the existence of borders. And, if you kumbaya your way out of them, in some sort of idea of, like, I don't know, universal humanity, bad things will happen to whatever you think your society is. I think that's like the fair reading of that. Does not mean that like, Europe needs to, I don't know, mobilize to such an extent that there's, like fences and walls and soldiers. But it does mean that, like, you do need to take borders seriously. And basically the existence of any political entity, I would argue to you, implies the existence of borders. It implies the existence of a
and borders
community,
imply the existence of enforcement, and enforcement requires violence at the last instance.
Yeah, at the limit. That's correct.
Yeah,
and
no, I agree with that. Like, I'm not. Yeah, I'm not a utopian. We need borders. We have borders, as a matter of fact, and enforcement of those borders requires violence. I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree with
so
military alliances. But there's a sort of mysticism about war now. There's a sort of
let's build to that.
There's an ideology
because I want to build to that, because your essay starts. I think it's very nice beginning to the essay. You take us back to that famous movie, A Few Good Men, and that one speech there by Jack Nicholson's character, I believe, right?
Yeah.
Where basically just makes the case like, oh, you lily-livered little pussy of a lawyer civilian, you don't understand, your entire society depends on the existence of people like me to protect you from just like chaos outside. And I was struck by that. I thought it was like really well done as a lead-in, but I was struck by the assertion you had that like people watching the movie back then would side with the lawyer and not with like evil Jack Nicholson. I'm not sure that was the case, at least for me watching it back then. And I think like the reason that scene is so famous and so good is because actually it does cut both ways, and I think there's a lot of truth in it. And again, coming on the heels of the Cold War, I don't think the 1990s necessarily presented to people that like all of that was falling away. I mean, the idea of the equivalent of like Guardians of the Republic, right? Again, an idea that's pretty that has a beard. I don't know. I think it's very intuitive to a lot of people. I don't think that's somehow that like we're now regressing to a certain kind of extra militarism. I mean, again, I do think you're picked up on something in this like weird jingoism that has like sprouted up in the last few weeks, which happens in general when you know, like when the polis gets horny for war. But like overall, the idea that like I guess that the main sort of thing is this question of, you know, is there a category of peace and a category of war that makes sense? Rather than
off.
That's what I meant by hiving off. Yeah.
I mean, I think I probably agree with you that there's no such thing as a steady state of peace in any human society. And, you know, you and I both live in big cities, and we are more or less aware there's violence going on in our cities at all times. And the police is deployed for a reason, and the police sometimes makes the violence itself. So, yeah, no, I agree with you that, well, this is the thing. Then there is no walled garden. I mean, that the part of what's objectionable about Burrell's quote is that he thinks that there's order and peace inside the walled garden, and there's a jungle outside of it. Well, we both know that there's violence within Europe as well.
But so
and
what? Like,
there is order,
violence.
But that
That's
order
violence.
comes at a cost. And not totally,
but where does
because
that
part
take
of
you?
the prosperity
But, Santi,
of
where
Europe
does that
is
take you?
due to violence that they did a century ago in colonialism.
Wait, Santi, where does that take
It
you? Though?
wasn't
Where
just-
does that take you? But so what is acknowledging that give you? It doesn't get you out of anything. Is basically saying like, well, there's violence everywhere. What's offensive about that? Like, there's violence that
What's offensive
that
about
we
it is that
sanction, and then there's the violence that foreigners, like the out group. There is the existence of an out group that, like, you know, at the limit, any in group has to like organize against. Every society, you know, it's not that every society defines itself against what's outside, but like every society cannot be perfectly porous, and therefore like discriminates against the outside, I guess is the way to put it. Like necessarily,
Look, and in the podcast we made with Fukuyama, by the way, that will drop eventually, he does give you an explanation as to why you can reconcile liberal internationalism with the existence of states and borders, and I agree with that. I mean, this side of paradise, you have the necessary evil of borders, but again, if we're thinking in terms of
necessary
the
evil
idea
of borders.
Well, I mean, I think division among the human family, within the human family, is kind of tragic.
Tragic? Evil?
Well, I don't know. If evil, it's fallen. I don't want to use a
Fallen,
theological term. I want to stay within natural reason here, as it were.
But I think
this is so. But just,
let me just be.
But the idea, by the way, the idea that there are borders is a little bit of a fiction as well, right? So the border between the U.S. and Mexico is a quasi fiction, because it's not like an eternal truth that there are Mexican people and American people. That border has switched several times. By the way, Spain was there before, and there were Aztecs, Toltecs. There was all sorts of peoples, and the people that actually live in that region themselves are mestizo. They're a collection of all these different.
I'm not making race. I'm not making like racial arguments for like delineating.
But I'm saying that what we're defending is in large part a fiction and a sort of bureaucratic necessity. But there's nothing like deep that we're defending when we're defending a border.
The
right?
worst thing that the New York Times ever published was this idea that, you know, I was an explainer by one of the stupidest thing that the New York Times ever published, like ever in its history, was an explainer while they were still like poaching people from Vox, and it was an explainer about nationalism. You know, like it was an explainer, and it was just like, you know, the guy like saw imagined communities on someone's bookshelf, and he was like, "Oh, imagined. That means they're fake. It's just like
I'm not saying they're fake, Damir. I'm saying that they're mixed.
The main thing is if you don't start, I think, if you don't start with the core premise that, like, I think in describing the world, if you start with the idea that, like, well, you know, this is just not a core starting premise of like how to understand the world, but is actually something fungible, and we start with the premise of a universal human community, and then say, well, there are these tragic things that history and happenstance have created. The next logical step in that is how do we transcend these things?
Yeah,
And
we
I think
should
that-
try to
and-
transcend
and
them.
I think that's absolutely crazy because
But that you don't,
that-
because
that gets
one
at-
way
no,
of
no, no, but-
transcending them, one way of trying to transcend them is to try to regulate war and to minimize the necessity of war.
Insane.
And which we have done in history. There is a way that wars have become more destructive, but they've also become more rare. So
Largely
we should
because we
keep trying to
invented-
do that.
largely,
And
I would argue
and
to
the
you-
way backwards is to mystify war the way people do now, which is to say, well, the West obtained all of its greatness thanks to war, which is not true. It obtained it. If you want to talk, I don't know if I agree with the concept of the West for complicated reasons that I'll write about one day maybe, but Socrates, in fact, got killed by a democracy, right? And the reason why his ideas percolated was because they were held by students who traveled around under different regimes, all right, and survived wars themselves and survived shipwrecks. If you want to say about Jesus Christ, if you think Jesus Christ is integral to the West, he got crucified. It was a disaster. The guy didn't succeed in any political project. So that's the thing. Don't mystify war by saying, oh, what keeps her walled garden in place is the warriors patrolling in the perimeter. And I don't want to, I'm not saying that there is no identity within the United States to protect. I'm not saying that there isn't a state to protect. And I definitely don't want to say anything against the military. I don't buy this left-wing disdain for the armed forces. I'm wearing a USA shirt because I love this country. But
no one's accusing
the
you of that.
biggest I know, but the biggest witnesses of the non-noble nature of war are soldiers, by the way, who've written, by the way.
Oh, sure, fine. Again, you know how much I loathe the keyboard jockeys. I loathe them fundamentally. And especially the ones that talk about it in terms of democracy. I find that so disgusting. And I'll say one of the greatest things that's happened or is about to happen. I saw a headline is State Department is about to cut all of its funding for democracy promotion. Very excited about that. So in fact, we're severing that most loathsome idea, so dear to people at the New York Times and the Atlantic, of the idea of war for democracy. I'm happy about that. That there's no chance that the war in Iran is going to be about supporting democracy in Iran. Thank goodness. That is a great development, a fantastic development, and I think it's gross that these people talk about it. But I want to go back to what we were just arguing about here before. I think that this is my starting premise. Again, obviously there's room to disagree here, and we are disagreeing about it. But
disagreement is better.
Regulating conflict between entities is not a process of rational positive sum stuff. That's a very core starting premise for me. Is you're not. This is not humanity's transcending fallenness in this world. And creating progress through rational understanding and acceptance of this, so that the human family over time will somehow unite. I don't see any evidence of that. And I from my own sort of starting premises, I think that's a deeply utopian way to think about things, and it's just I don't know, it's not borne out. The argument I would make for the war thing, quite frankly, is nuclear weapons. I think it's fascinating that in the last, I don't know, couple of years, I think the sort of the pall of the Cold War and the sort of long shock of America coming out on top and all adversaries being much lower, that took a while to work out. Now we're waking up to the, I think, very human understanding that war can still be waged in a nuclear era, and that not all wars go nuclear. I think that there's a big taboo about this. Certain things have happened is that we've created many more gradations on the escalatory ladder, through technology, between the big one, the the civilization ending thing, which I think is kept war at bay, and everything from battlefield nukes, tactical nukes, all the rest of that. I think we have all sorts of gradations, and now states that are
I don't know if those are a fiction, by the way, because I still don't understand what a tactical nuke is.
It's small.
Yeah, a smaller nuke. This doesn't make sense. That's another part of the myth here. But anyway, go on. A lot of gradations.
Hold on. But wait, what do you mean a myth? All
it hasn't been used.
Well, I mean,
low yield nuclear weapon in Ukraine. How is that going to make any difference on the escalatory ladder?
Because doctrine does not say that if well, I mean, it hasn't been developed. I mean, there have been all sorts of vague threats given, like what if, Russia were to vaporize a battalion in a field as opposed to nuke a city? What we'll do. I know like all sorts of threats were sent by the Biden administration that if you do this, we'll do X, Y, and Z. We didn't say we'd nuke Moscow, though, if they did that. We, I think, threatened to destroy their fleet or something like that. So again, like the potential use of a nuclear weapon on a battlefield that does not obliterate a city does not yield necessarily maximum retaliation from, the United States, and therefore you have gradations at least theoretical gradations in the escalatory ladder. And I would
realize
argue
what you're talking about here is language, not just brute force. Because if we're like communicating ahead of time what the escalatory tit for tat is going to be, there is a sort of communication happening, not just brute force.
But let's.
Have you ever seen 13 Days about the
No.
Cuban Missile Crisis based on RFK's book, RFK Senior?
No.
So there's a
hold on,
point
Santi,
which. Okay, go ahead.
I want to just say one more thing I just want to add to all of this. And this is the other, I think, deep fallacy that arises from this kind of idea of rationalism and cooperation leading to the eradication of imaginary things like borders and differences between countries, And here's exactly to the point you were just making right now. The idea that diplomacy exists somehow separate from war is also nonsense or violence. And this is what I do think is one of the great things that was demonstrated in this thing that's happening right now. It may well fail. We might be in a shooting war with Iran again within weeks, months, whatever, as we'll see where it goes. But what we just witnessed in the last week with Trump going for it and then immediately de-escalating with them, which is part of the story. This was like broadly reported that like the Iranians came in. Trump bombed and immediately sent a message to the Iranians saying like, this is the last one. We're done. Iranians said, we're not negotiating until the Israelis stop. Then they telegraphed what they were going to do exactly to the Qataris, exactly where the bases are. So we intercepted everything and then said, we're done. At which point Trump pounced and said, okay, now we negotiate.
You're breaking up a little bit, Damir.
This is that like the use of a bludgeon, of military force, is fundamentally, whether threatened or done, is a part of diplomacy. Absolutely is. The point is that, like, if you don't understand that that basically diplomacy and war are coterminous in one sort of thing, I think that misunderstanding is the exact same misunderstanding as this idea that like we're rationally moving towards like a better world where we can negotiate and make the salience of borders less. Again, it's this like fake distinction between war and peace, a fake distinction between, the or it's part of this fantasy of like a single human community. I really think that's what it is.
Let me just respond here because you don't realize that what you're saying cuts both ways. Okay, so first of all, if I'm in a fist fight with you and then Shadi comes and breaks us up and says you guys should talk about it instead of fighting, is that progress? Is that a better situation than just us being in a fist fight? Because that's really all we're talking about. And if you're saying, wait a sec. And if you're saying that there's no such thing as diplomacy without the threat of violence, without the threat of war, which is true, but that there's a flip side to that, which is that war always has within it elements of diplomatic communication. And just the fact now that we have a hyper-sophisticated, telegraphed ahead of time, escalatory, tit-for-tat expectations means, by the way, that we're not dealing with this sort of mythical brute force, but we're dealing with a sort of communication. And by the way, just when the Russians... Hang on, Damir. When the Russians... remember when Biden started okaying using, I forget which missiles, into Russian territory back in December, and everyone freaked out. And then the Russians used an intercontinental ballistic missile into Ukrainian territory, obviously without a nuclear warhead. But they told the U.S. ahead of time, right? There was a communication. So there is part of the absurdity of all of this stuff is that there is communication within this sort of destruction. The idea that there is never society fully at peace without war means that war is never fully without the elements of peace and communication.
Fine,
and if you can't understand that, you don't believe your own theory.
The absurdity of you is that you're making this distinction. My whole point is there is no distinction. There is no bad
I'm
war
saying
and
the
good
same thing.
peace.
The two things are porous, but we can emphasize the fact that these two things are porous.
No,
we should stop talking about a walled garden. We should stop talking about we are the humble, civilized people, and we need, the strong to defend us. And now let's go bomb Iran.
No, come on, man. Come on. Listen.
Well,
the
that's
point
what my
is,
article's against. Like,
I
don't
know,
know.
but that's what I'm saying. Like, the part that I think, like, the article, I think, sets up a correct, I think, enemy in this idea of basically jingoism that's happening right now. That's absolutely correct, right? Where I
but
think,
it's not just jingoism. What I'm against, first of all, jingoism in a way is more limited destruction because jingoism is a passion. But what I'm talking about is ideology. What I'm talking about is this idea that the West is decadent and the only way out of decadence is through creative destruction. All right, and it's something Edward Luttwak says explicitly. It's something that the neoconservative caucus, or whatever remains of them, and whatever the hawks are, whatever you want to call the hawks in the White House today, still has this idea that we are old and decrepit, and the heroism that war brings out is what's going to revive the West. And what I'm saying is that the things that they admire about the West were not created through creative violence. They were created through moments of, when we got lucky, or grace in the history of nations, or different history of thought. All right. And war is just as likely to destroy, pulverize all those things as to maintain them. Right. The fact that Paris and Venice were not destroyed in World War II is dumb luck, is this sort of tacit agreement between the Nazis and the Allies. They said, let's not bomb our nicest stuff. What is that? What is that conscience inside of them, Damir? It's something beyond this pulverizing, destructive nature
look, man.
that you think is paramount.
It is paramount. Look,
it's not paramount. Obviously not. Obviously not.
You cite Jesus and Socrates as like Western civilization. When then you, in the next breath, you cite Paris and Venice. Venice's greatness as cultural artifacts is because they were the capitals of empire. And what are empires but actually motors of conquest and war? So let's be clear about this.
I'm not saying that violence doesn't play a role in human history, and abundance, obviously money flowing into Venice helped out. But the genius of the artists that flourished in Italy during the Renaissance is not because they were bloodthirsty maniacs.
No, but again, the point is this, is as soon as you set yourself up as just like war is something that's bad and exists outside, that must be, and like it is
something bad. How can you not say that it's something bad?
I would say it is like, it's bad insofar as the world is bad, but like to actually try and exorcise it from the world is
Why is it wrong to minimize it? Minimize the impact. I'm not saying we should no longer have standing armies. I'm not even saying we shouldn't have a nuclear deterrent. I don't know about that yet. But
one doesn't minimize it. I would say to you, one does not minimize it by proselytizing against it and moralizing against it. That's a huge mistake. One minimizes it, quite frankly, through paying attention to it and paying attention to diplomacy, the uses of violence, threats, and catastrophe. Like it's like the art of statesmanship is a tragic art. It is a tragic art of managing things so they don't go terribly wrong. And what you ultimately see, we'll see how this Trump gambit works. Trump seems to have just like hit really hard, and now he's trying to dial it back and be like, "Oh, who hit you? Oh, who hit you? You okay? Let's talk."
Well, and he even like he sort of like panders to them, right? Or he told them, he said they're courageous. Trump,
yeah. No,
play
exactly.
psychologically.
I think Trump is a fascinating figure, and like this episode, even if it doesn't yield a lasting sort of solution, and we're back at it at a certain point, is going to be studied for a very long time. But it should be studied in the sense of pure diplomacy and violence and how this actually works in the world, without this garbage ideology that I think people like David Brooks lard on this idea that like we go to war for values. That like we go to war to liberate the Iranian people from theocratic regimes. I find that like revolting, and that's the ideology. That's like this kind of like war ideology, like war for good, that I'm absolutely against. Mm-hmm. But I think that the idea of
But you
understanding,
are an ally to that ideology without knowing it, because you do believe that war is the father of all.
I'm certainly not on this.
You are
idea.
mystifying war as much as they are. They just have a liberal veneer on the mystification of war, and you don't.
Fine,
Because you're smarter.
Well,
then you need to demit. That is part of what contributes to war. Is this idea that war is part of like the life
to war, Santi? That's the sentence I'm fighting you on. Like, oh, what contributes to war? What are you talking about? There's no.
Well, look,
getting
if
out
in
of
the
it.
West we have so much power. We have so many diplomatic means. Look how in fact, the fact that Iran was less able to fight back than people expected, it already shows how much power the West has, how much leverage we have.
Should we have not?
We
done
should be
this?
using it instead of celebrating the idea of war as some sort of civilizational.
No. Hold on, but Santi, let me
boost.
ask you. What did you? I'm hesitant to make up my mind as to what happened this week because I think events are still happening, and we'll see how this plays out.
Well,
but
me too.
Now,
I don't know.
Now, as we're recording on a Friday, what do you think? Was this a catastrophic thing that shouldn't have been done, or was this like smack and destruction, even if it didn't destroy the nuclear program, actually diplomacy
it's
done
too
at the
soon to
limit
tell.
properly?
I mean, too soon to tell.
Fine.
Because Danielle Pletka, for example, is already saying that we're going to need to fight Iran again down the line.
I mean, I'm not saying we
so
have
it's
to or
part
not.
of a larger thing. What I'm trying to say is that this larger narrative of war with Iran, which by the way echoes the Greeks and the Persians, echoes this idea that we always need an other to fight against, is something we should try to transcend.
It's not.
You need to see war. You need to see these battles as diseases, not as heroic events.
Or one needs to just understand it that like this is what human beings do, and that we're forever fallen. We're forever fallen, and there's no improvement of it, Santi. There's no improvement of the human condition.
You want Christianity without grace, is what you want.
No, I just want.
We're forever fallen.
I want Santi. What I want is you not to be taking grace upon yourself as an intellectual, that you can with your capacious brain bring good outcomes for humanity.
No, I'm not trying to make good outcomes for humanity. I'm just attacking an ideology as a citizen of the United States that's hurting our country. It has hurt our country.
What's hurt our country
to put us into a huge war with Iraq. It destroyed the hopes of our generation.
The huge problem, the huge toxic ideology, the toxic part is this idea that they're doing it for something good. You're closer to them than I am, quite frankly. Because
no, you
are. I'm saying that basically war ideally resets things and gives us a respite until the next one. It does not improve the world one way at all. It's not an improvement thing. Usually it has to do with complex things of how societies interact with what's outside of societies. And getting around that is impossible.
You're talking about war as this complex system where we reset communications, and then you're saying, well, we can't control it. You can't have one or the other. I think war in the 21st century, with all the technology that we have, all the means we have to leverage different things. You talk to Bruno Macias, who's been here before in the podcast. He talks about how the whole metaverse, the internet, is now another domain of war, another domain of leverage too. It's a sophisticated game now where sometimes people get killed, and we should be able to play the game in a way that minimizes death and destruction. And in order to do that, we have to stop thinking about war as this generative force that's going to revive the West. The reason why, if the West exists, the reason why it's dying is not because of lack of conflict. It's for lack of meaning of one sort or another. We can talk about that in some other podcast.
Technology,
but let's stop talking about...
pretty uncontroversial point that technology, right? The internet, everything we're using right now, obviously comes from investment in war making. Again, like most of the technology that we have, one way or the other, is like the civilizational sort of stuff of like cutting edge things that were developed to like stay ahead of the enemy, one way or the other, funded by the state in all sorts of ways. Again, this is a long-standing pattern in modern societies. This is not to say that one celebrates war as the mother of invention or anything like that. But again, like this idea...
That was a great band.
Yeah. but
I love Frank Zappa.
But you know what I mean? Like I don't know, Santi. Like I think that I, even as we're discussing here, overall, I do think we agree. But I just see you just falling back into this kind of, like, quite frankly, a default progressive utopianism, quiet as it is. Like, you think that we can make the world better. And what I'm arguing for is an acceptance of a kind of fatalism where at the limit you can avert catastrophe if you're lucky, and not permanently, just like maybe avoid it here or there. That's the main thing. It's like a deeply unheroic history is the way I see it. Like, and that's what I'm saying. So this is why you said, I want Christianity without grace. No. I want no heroes among human beings. That's the best way to understand the world.
But then where does the concept of hero come from?
I
if
don't
it doesn't
know.
actually exist.
Where
does the concept of hero come from?
I don't understand. What do you mean?
Like you're like, heroes don't exist, but everyone thinks about heroes. Everyone expects a hero. Everyone wants a hero. Why do we think we even have that idea then? If it's never really existed.
So we can only come up with stuff that like, I don't know, what's
I don't know. It seems like everyone spots heroes in history and in life, but you're just saying that they don't exist anywhere.
I don't know. People make stuff up, like talk about stuff. We can talk about categories that don't actually affect how the world works.
So the idea of a hero is like the idea of a unicorn.
Kind of, yeah.
Or like Batman.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
they
I think
don't actually exist.
In general,
so Churchill, not a hero, right?
Churchill?
Yeah.
Did you say? No,
Yeah.
I you know, that's really funny. Went to this book talk. And it was about basically the Allies. I'll put the link to the book. It's by this guy Tim Bouvier. I think the book's called Allies at War or something like that. It was a really good book discussion. We'll put a link in the show notes. We should have him on. Actually, he's really smart. But it was an interesting thing there. It was talking about the extent to which, you know, the Churchill, how much he was manipulating the United States into coming into the war because he knew that they were screwed, and how in many ways FDR, the most like Sphinx-like of presidents we've ever had, really just impossible to pin down because he, like, you know, you can read him many different ways, and he was a really Machiavellian sort of character. Like, basically, you know, smack the Brits around. And so what we're left with is this incredible myth making of like the special relationship and Churchill, the great hero, and the rest of it. But it was a nasty bit of business where the United States like knocked its historical greatest rival like off at the knees, and they never recovered. And it's funny. The other like parallel, I was thinking about that. And the reason I bring that up, not just because you brought up Churchill, but like watching the Iran-Israel war and Israel begging the United States to come and like do it and come in and do the bombing. It is fascinating that as soon as Trump went in there, the next day, as soon as the Iranians retaliated and then the ceasefire was reached, he publicly humiliated Bibi Netanyahu by calling him up, not just calling him up, and making him turn planes in midair and come back. Then tweeting to everyone, it's like, look what I did to Bibi. Like, I've told them to pull his planes back and just wave, do a plane wave as they fly over. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And so the now you see Ron Dermer, the ambassadors, being like, this is an incredible moment. The United States is now once again involved in the Middle East and all the rest of this. I feel like in so many ways, Israel would have been better served for its own independence of action by not having the United States come in. Like, I think basically now they're back on the chain where, quite frankly, I think they belong. But like, this idea that, like, again, heroism plays any sorts of role in any of this sort of stuff, where like sentiment and warm feelings, and again this fictional thing of, you know, a hero. I don't know. I think in general.
Why don't you think Churchill's a hero, though? I mean, he was a great orator, wasn't he?
Sure.
And he was a great leader.
Yeah, I mean, he made some
What is it
calls.
that bothers you about
Doesn't
Churchill?
bother
me. Is it Dresden? You don't like Dresden?
Oh, I love Dresden. That was my favorite part. I loved it. I love
No,
Hiroshima. I love Dresden.
He's
I
not.
love that stuff.
He's joking, listeners. No, but
the point is well, I mean, I think Dresden's a good example as well. What I don't like about the heroes, then you also get the villain, you know, because then you'll be like, you have this character of Churchill the hero, and then you'll get people writing things, but like, oh my God, but you know, the Boer War and his policy, you know, on all the barbarisms of his early sort of thing as the head of an empire, quite frankly, again. And then you get I think like a pretty dumb discussion, quite frankly. A really dumb discussion once you get into this question of heroes and villains. When you start to flatten everything. It's a flattening mechanism and exercise to do it. Just as flattening as it is to say war bad, peace good. And rather understanding that like war and peace are basically the fabric of international relations, and it's the same fabric, basically. Diplomacy and violence, war and peace.
Right, which again means that even if the threat of violence is in diplomacy, the diplomatic communications are happening within violence.
Diplomatic communications are... people like to think that
like
diplomacy
for example,
is good.
when
Diplomacy is compelling the other side not through like
you're giving primacy
argument.
to war, and I'm saying that war doesn't have primacy.
My point is that
the
like,
diplomacy side of the spectrum and the war side of the spectrum both have equal weight, and you're saying the force has more weight. You know what weight the other side has. So if the war side has the weight of force of the punch in your face, the bombing of your country, what is the weight of the other side? The weight of the other side are the things that you want to protect with war. All right,
Disagree.
And that is Venice, that is your family, that is what people call civilization, right? And those things that you're trying to protect, they're not the product of war, but they are the counterweight, because one thing that prevents you from going all the way, and this was proven in that Tony Judt passage that I said, one thing that prevents you from being completely destructive is that those things still have a pull on your soul, and they make you restrain yourself from destroying everything.
No.
So if war is a continuation of politics through other means, right? If it is a continuation of diplomacy in a certain sense, it's also restrained by the same things that politics and diplomacy are trying to protect. And it should be more restrained. And what this ideology does, the one that I reject in my article, is it muddies that. And it says that those things that we're trying to protect are actually the product of war. And we can't respect them. And that's not to disparage the armed forces. I know that like the Marines have this great poem that they say that the soldier is the first defender of religious liberty, and that there is a certain wisdom to that. I'm not disparaging that at all. What I'm disparaging is an ideology that sends them to war, and usually for bad reasons, right? And celebrating it, using the means of communication and politics to celebrate this narrative, you know, that is very, very bad, and we should avoid it.
Here's a metaphor that's raw off in all of this, though, right? Is the idea that like basically the roots of war are like ultimately a disagreement that can be bridged through rational discussion better. And that when you resort to violence, like passions have overtaken reason. I think that's one way of thinking about this, which is wrong. I think fundamentally is off. So it's just like we must restrain our passions and revert to reason, because two reasonable people, if they're discussing something, there's maybe, you know, but there's usually some kind of give or take that can be done, and we can avoid like giving into our passions and destroying a bunch of stuff. And that's, I think, a fundamentally incorrect view of how to view things, is really what it comes down to. Wars are not irrational.
Yeah, but I don't think what I wrote requires thinking of that, things that way.
But hold on. But diplomacy is not rational and war irrational. It's best to think of states as these things that try to take advantage of whatever. That's what humans, like societies, do, is like try and maximize advantage to themselves. They run into like things on the outside that prevent them. That's also the most human thing, is to like basically do as much as you can until you're like checked by nature or something else. That's the reality of it. And so, our friend Frank Fukuyama talks about basically that human instinct of like desiring greatness, tumos, right? Is like basically assertion. That is at the core of everything. And diplomacy is basically the one part of the spectrum when you encounter something outside, and exists on a perfectly flat spectrum between arguing, trying to sort of compel the other person through dialogue, usually with the threat of violence behind it. You do this or I'll. Now, in that part of the spectrum, it is threats and unmeasurable. When you go into violence, all of a sudden, the threats are measured against reality. And so war ends up testing what the two sides, what they can actually check each other on. And then you have basically a reversion back to, after it's been tested, usually, if one is, we haven't seen like a proper defeat in a really long time. We haven't had like a proper war in a very long time. It's like actually just flattened. But then you test, both sides have learned something by being violent with each other. More information is sort of, again, in the system. And then we're back to like talking less, because war is costly. I'd say that's the other part on the side of the
so none of this says that we should use the mechanisms that we can to minimize the fighting part of the spectrum.
But listen to me. The main thing is, Santi, the main thing is like, it's a first principles discussion here. And that's why I keep pushing you on this, because everything you keep falling back on is like, I like grant this, that, the other thing, but you're still falling back on this idea that like a moral argument about war. And I think the place where morality like basically should enter into it is at a much higher level than you're doing it, which is to say, to appreciate the horrible, tragic nature of the world and bemoan it, and as statesmen, like understanding that war is necessary in the interaction between states, and threats and violence are implicit in every interaction between human beings, that therefore you need to husband this both, by being extra threatening where you can get best benefit and then avoid war. Basically, it's that spectrum. And as soon as you start like moralizing at a lower level, being like that like as a statesman, you are immoral if you do like war and not like trust into diplomacy, that misunderstands the whole thing. And this is why I will say, whatever happens after this last week, I think was an incredibly interesting example of how diplomacy and war and violence interact, and in a very amoral way to understand how that is, Will this work? I don't know. I'm not sure. And I do think the Iranians have every incentive right now to ignore Trump, take what they can get at the negotiating table and go back to building a nuclear weapon. And we'll probably be back at this at some point. But yeah, look, I mean, that's my main point. That's it for part one, dear listeners. There's a lot more where that came from. If you're not yet a paying subscriber, please head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and become one. Help support our work. Hope to see you in the bonus.